Well, it's not every day that I get to talk to a quarterbacks expert. So I'm glad that Crissy Froyd is here to kind of help me get set for this year's NFL draft. Crissy, it's great to have you with me. I know you work for a bunch of different outlets, NBC Sports, you work for The Edge, you work for SI. I know you cover college football pretty closely. Welcome. Thanks for being with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I'll just admit to you now, I've been following how wild NFL free agency has been, that I haven't really had a chance to kind of hone in on some of the quarterbacks in this upcoming draft. Can you go ahead and, outside of the major names, can you go ahead and just tell me who you're really kind of keeping a close eye on, who you're really profiling heading into this year's draft?
Yeah, well, I think Carson Strong is kind of who people know me for. That's been my number one quarterback really since probably week 2 of this past college football season. I think that from a pure passing perspective, that he is by far the best developed quarterback, especially when it comes to the deep ball placed down the sideline. It's kind of interesting, though, because when you look at it, a lot of people have this kind of stigma toward air raid quarterbacks because the league has trended in a direction where we saw for a long period of time these guys like Lamar Jackson really kind of getting all the kudos. And then everyone was like, well, maybe all quarterbacks need to be super mobile to succeed, which I don't think is the case, because I think over time you see this thing where there's a phenomenon. So if a quarterback is asked to run basically his entire career, there's a good chance, this is not everybody, but there's a good chance that he was never fully developed as a passer. And so over time, he's going to eventually slow down. And we've seen that with guys like Lamar Jackson, guys like Cam Newton, and then they have to kind of undergo this process where they improve as a passer. So now I think the league's starting to trend more toward a quarterback who can throw the ball like a pocket passer, but has a little bit of mobility. Now, Carson doesn't have a ton of mobility, but I think he's shown this offseason that he does have some escapability, some ability to run the ball whenever he's asked to do so. So that's my number one. My number 2 is Kenny Pickett. I think that he has the highest floor. He's above average in pretty much every category of quarterbacking. And then Malik Willis, I think, has become a popular 1 through 3 for pretty much everybody. I wasn't really impressed with what I saw on tape this past season, but he has all the athletic gifts you could want. And then I think throughout this offseason, he's really shown some maturation as a passer, throwing the ball with touch, a lot of things like that. So if he can keep that up, then I think he has the highest ceiling in this class.
That's an interesting trend that you bring up, teams kind of shifting away from these physical quarterbacks who really know how to move with the ball. Is that physical breakdown why you see guys like Lamar Jackson and Cam and some of these guys maybe not have the shelf life of, say, a prolific passer like an Aaron Rodgers or a Tom Brady? I mean, is that kind of the root of what you're noticing, that their bodies just eventually kind of give way and they don't have the skill set to rely on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that every quarterback over time slows down. I think that's natural, really, for any position. Everybody slows down. And so if you haven't had a lot of experience throwing the ball because you weren't asked to, some of those issues you might have mechanically or with arm strength and stuff, they become more apparent. And so I think that's why pocket passers tend to last longer. And then the guys that don't run, they've been focusing on pure passing for their entire career. And so they're going to be the most polished at it.
What do you think is possible in terms of taking a guy who's doesn't have that skill set or isn't, like you say, a prolific pocket passer and making them better in that regard? I mean, have you gotten any sense from coaches or teams about how much of that is sort of ingrained in you from how you were coached growing up and coming through the college game, and how much can maybe be fine tweaked once they fit with the NFL team that they're drafted to? Because, that's such a huge part of it. Is I feel like the quarterback nowadays, especially in today's game, almost has to perfectly fit the system that they go to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an adjustment for any quarterback that goes on to a different system, because the college level, in so many aspects, unless you come from a complete pro style system, there's going to be a lot of changes, a lot of adjustment. I see, especially with this class, there's a lot of guys who have mentioned footwork to me, that they're having to learn different NFL footwork, which is part of it. But then you see guys like Sam Howell and the way that Phil Longo runs his system at North Carolina, they really don't put a ton of emphasis on the footwork. And so I think that maybe he has a little bit more of a curve there than maybe somebody who came from a pro style system. So I think that there are some tweaks to be made as far as that classifies as lower body mechanics, obviously. And then looking at quarterbacking as a whole, everything starts from the ground up. So I think a lot of these guys, that at least that I've talked to going through off-season training, have mentioned kind of fine-tuning some of those lower body mechanics and things like that improve accuracy. Some of these guys that maybe didn't have a completion percentage that jumped off paper.
It's really interesting to hear you break everything down. I mean, for you personally, just kind of getting to know you and your background, what was it about specifically analyzing the quarterback position that appealed to you?
Yeah, because it's so intricate, and I feel like people have so many different split opinions on it. I feel like there's a lot more people who can agree on what's a good wide receiver, what's a good cornerback, a good safety, because they all kind of are asked to do the same things. But a quarterback's going to fit into a system differently. And then some people kind of, I guess, latch on more to this trend of guys with mobility. There are some people who are like me that have a lot more value for guys who are pure pocket passers. And there's just a lot of split opinions on how do you overhaul mechanics, stuff like that. So I think it's interesting because there's just so many different aspects and then so many different avenues you can go down, and people have different opinions on each of them depending on fit, what can be changed, what can't. And so I've really enjoyed that.
You know, uh, Obviously, one of the big storylines in the offseason was Deshaun Watson ending up in Cleveland. And it kind of got me thinking about what teams prioritize when it comes to somebody that could potentially make a difference. And not even that he's a guy who's going to ultimately have, a tremendously different impact than maybe what they can already be this season. But in covering quarterbacks so closely and in assessing the draft and which teams are, looking for quarterbacks, what sense do you get, if any, about what is the true priority for an NFL team when it comes to an NFL quarterback these days?
Well, I think intangibles and then football IQ is a big deal because it seems to me, at least like a lot of these teams, the trend that I've seen is that there's so many people that want to plug in this quarterback and see him do well from the get-go, which I think last year's quarterback class maybe taught us that even these guys that have these super high ceilings, some of which maybe even called generational talents, that depending on the system that they go into and how bad the rest of the team is, that they can't fix it by themselves. But I think that that's a priority for teams, is how quickly can you pick it up? How quickly can you adjust? But what I'd like to see moving forward is to kind of move away from that, because I think regardless of how good a quarterback is as a rookie, that it's always going to be best to sit him for the first year. So I think that from an intangibles perspective. And then I think that as much as it's not my thing, I think there's a lot of teams that do like to see at least some adequate mobility and the ability to say, hey, we can use design quarterback runs with this guy.
How much pressure is on some of these quarterbacks to perform right off the bat? Like you said, perfect world, a guy you would think, get some time to get adjusted or sit. But it seems like if you get one of the top draft picks, or, you get this incredible young player, the expectation is that they will be able to fire at a high level in the offensive system that they're in right away. You talk to a lot of young quarterbacks. You cover the college game closely and watch the draft and then watch how they make that transition to the pro game. Do you get a sense that that pressure is heavier than ever? Is it fair for us to expect that, like you said, a rookie can go in and figure out a way to be productive right off the bat?
Yeah, I think that it's heavy, but I do think with this class that we see a lot more guys that, at least I think, that teams are going to take and say, okay, we're going to put this guy as a backup, or there's going to be a very clear competition in which someone else might win out. And I think we've also seen that with how many quarterbacks have moved around just within the past few weeks this offseason going to teams. I think we're going to see those guys take the field. And I think that this is a class that I view overall, I don't really see anyone that I would deem to be a first-year starter. Not that I think anyone really should be, but there's no one in this class that every single one of them to me is missing a little bit of something that needs to be developed and needs to be developed for at least a year. So I don't think any of these guys are first-year starters, and I would hope that the teams that pick them up don't view them that way either.
Yeah, I was going to ask you kind of what you thought about the group as a whole compared to some of these other draft years. Are they a middle of the pack group of quarterbacks?
I'd say a lot of them are middle of the pack, but there's kind of been this narrative that's going around now that this quarterback class might as well be written off. There's not enough talent in it. Let's just hold off till next year if you really need a quarterback coming out of college, which I don't think is true. I think that if Carson Strong can maintain confidence, and I think that if he has some time and has an adequate offensive line and goes to his system, kind of like the same way that Mac Jones went to the Patriots, where they cater to him like that, and it's good for a pure pocket passer, still has a really high ceiling. So, and then there's also guys like Bailey Zappi that I think he's most people's probably QB 5 through 10. I thought he did a lot of really good things at Western Kentucky, broke a lot of FBS records. So really made a statement there, and then comes into the Senior Bowl and shows that he can hang with these guys that are higher level competition. Because, that's the narrative surrounding the small school guys, is that even though they can't control who they play with or who they play against, that just because you come from a small school that you can't be any good, which is false. So I think that there's a lot of hidden talent just within each of these players that I think at least one of them is really going to hit.
So you think there might be a Tom Brady or maybe somebody half as talented still to come, like out of a main program or a smaller program that's written off, or maybe like you said doesn't have all the pieces right off the bat, that is still more than capable, in this class or future classes of performing at a high level.
Yeah, like I mentioned with Bailey and Carson, and there's also Desmond Ritter, who really just overall was kind of lackluster this season, but you could argue that he has the best set of foundational traits to build upon. And he's mentioned to me that he's also been working on lower body mechanics to improve balance in the pocket, to improve overall accuracy, and that he feels that he's gotten a lot better. He's throwing the ball better. And if any analysts take time to go back through some of these offseason training tapes where these guys are getting the opportunity to focus just on themselves and just on their mechanics for a few months, you can really see some overhaul even in guys that we haven't talked about in 2 years, which is always really interesting for me to watch. I think that Sam Howell has some transitions to make as far as the footwork thing goes. I think that's going to be somewhat difficult for him, but I think there's a lot of things to like about him as a passer and the way that he can kind of get gritty in that ground game too, and maybe he builds upon that. So I see a little bit of things that I like in every single one of these players. Like I mentioned, Kenny Pickett above average in every category, will at least be a high level backup moving forward. Malik Willis, if he can maintain what he's done as a passer over offseason showcases for whatever that's worth, is going to have the highest ceiling in this class. So I think that there's a lot of really intriguing pieces of every one of these quarterbacks, and that at least one of them, like I said, is going to hit. And I think it's just interesting how people have kind of written it off as, oh, this is not a Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson draft class, so let's just not even talk about quarterbacks.
Man, I think about so many teams who could really use even just like you said, a nominally talented quarterback in addition to what they've got going on in their roster outside from all the insane things that we've seen in free agency. Crissy, this was really fascinating. Tell people where we can find you.
Yeah, so I basically work with every quarterback in the country at the Draft Network. So I've done a lot of stuff on these upcoming guys, a lot of guys that are younger that won't be coming up for a couple years. Cover the Mississippi State Bulldogs for Sports Illustrated, and then do a lot of different stuff, mostly quarterback related with NBC Sports Edge.
All right, Crissy Froyd, thanks for being with us. Appreciate the time. We'll be watching.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.